I walked through the front door of my own home just 3 hours after watching my husband take his last breath. And before I could even set down the bag I had packed for his final hospital stay, I heard my mother-in-law laughing in my living room. Not crying, not praying, laughing. My name is Maya. I am 30 years old, and my husband Daniel died of a sudden cardiac arrest on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 days after his 34th birthday. He was healthy, driven, and the most quietly brilliant person I have ever known. He built his e-commerce business from a single spare bedroom in our first apartment, and by the time he passed, that business was generating over $400,000 a year in net profit. He also held a verified private trust containing $2.3 million, which his estate attorney had walked me through in a brief, gentle phone call while I was still sitting in the hospital parking garage, unable to start the car. I had married a man who loved me completely and planned for every possible future, including one without him in it. I pressed my key against the lock of my front door and stood there for a moment, listening. The laugh I heard belonged to my mother-in-law. Her name is Patricia, and she is a woman who has never once in 7 years of my marriage acknowledged a single thing I brought to her son's life. The voice responding to her belonged to my sister-in-law, Renee. Renee is 26, works part-time as a paralegal, and has spent the better part of our marriage inserting herself into every major financial decision Daniel and I ever made, offering unsolicited legal opinions at dinner, volunteering to help with business paperwork, and borrowing money from her brother that she never paid back. I stood in the cold March air, my hand on the door handle, and I listened. "She is not going to know what to do," my mother-in-law said, her voice light and comfortable, the way people sound when they believe they are completely alone. "She has always depended on him for everything. The girl barely knows how to balance a checkbook." That particular lie almost made me laugh out loud. I am a certified cybersecurity analyst for a mid-size financial firm. I build digital fraud detection systems for a living. I have spent the last 5 years teaching corporations how to catch people who lie with technology, but I stayed quiet and kept listening. "The business is the important part," Renee said. I heard the clink of what sounded like my wine glasses. She has no idea how it actually runs. I handled the back-end admin for almost 2 years. I have access to all the supplier accounts, the inventory platform, the payment processors. If she tries to take it over herself, it will fall apart in a month. Then she will need us. "And the trust?" my mother-in-law asked. Renee's tone shifted, lower and more careful. "I have been researching that. A private trust is much harder to contest than a will, but it is not impossible. If we can argue that Daniel was not in sound mental capacity when he drafted it, or that he was unduly influenced by her, we could file for an emergency freeze on the estate while it is under review. That would lock her out of everything for months, maybe longer. And while that drags through probate, the business still needs someone to manage it, which is where I come in." There was a pause, and then my mother-in-law spoke again in a quieter, almost satisfied voice. "We have given enough to this family. Daniel worked himself into an early grave, building something that should pass to his blood, not to a woman he knew for 7 years." I stood on my own front porch with my hospital bag still hanging from my shoulder, absorbing the full scope of what I had just heard. My husband had been dead for less than 12 hours. These 2 women were sitting inside my home, drinking my wine, and calmly mapping out how to strip me of everything he had spent his entire adult life building. I had 2 options. I could walk through that door and scream at them until my voice gave out, which would accomplish absolutely nothing. Or I could do what I have been professionally trained to do: stay silent, gather evidence, and build an airtight case before making a single move. I took a slow breath, put my phone back in my coat pocket, and pushed the door open. They performed beautifully. My mother-in-law was across the room in seconds, arms wrapped around me in a hug that felt like 2 pieces of cold wood pressing together. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said, and her voice cracked on cue. "We came as soon as we heard. We wanted to be here for you. You should not be alone tonight." Renee was already standing behind her, holding a glass of water she had poured for me, her expression arranged into something sympathetic. "We are so sorry, Maya," she said. "Daniel loved you so much. We just want to help you through this." I let them guide me to the couch. I let them bring me food I did not eat. I let them fill the house with the soft, carefully constructed sound of grief, while I sat and nodded and said almost nothing at all. That night, after they had both retreated to the guest rooms they had apparently decided to occupy without asking me, I went to my home office, locked the door behind me, and got to work. Daniel and I had talked about digital security the way most couples talk about insurance practically, without drama, because we understood what could happen if we were not careful. 3 years ago, after we launched the business, we sat down with a trust attorney and a digital estate planner and we locked everything down. Daniel's private trust was ironclad, drafted under New York law, and required absolutely no probate. Every major business account, suppliers, payment processors, inventory management was protected under two-factor authentication tied exclusively to my phone number and email address. What Renee did not know, because Daniel had quietly removed her admin access 8 months ago after he discovered several irregular transfers I am going to come back to, was that she had been locked out of the back end of his business for almost a year. She still thought she had the keys. She was operating on information that was almost a year out of date. I opened my laptop and spent the next 3 hours doing what I do best. I pulled every access log from our business platform going back 24 months. I cross-referenced login timestamps, IP addresses, and transaction records with the hours Renee claimed to be working. What I found was not surprising to me, because I had suspected something was wrong for months and had been quietly gathering data without telling anyone, including Daniel, because I had wanted to be completely certain before I said a word. Renee had been skimming from the business for 22 months. It was not massive, but it was consistent. Small transfers to a PayPal account in her name. Inflated invoices from suppliers she had introduced to Daniel, paid by the business, with kickbacks quietly routed back to her. A pattern so careful and gradual that if you were not specifically looking for it, it looked like normal operating variance. But I had been looking for it, and I had found it, and I had every single transaction documented in a time-stamped encrypted file that I had already forwarded to my own personal attorney 3 months ago. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, and for the first time that entire day, I let myself cry. Not about Renee, not about any of it, just about Daniel. I pressed my hands over my face in the dark of my own locked office, and I let myself fall apart quietly for exactly as long as I needed to, because I was not made of stone, and I had just lost the person I loved most in the world, and I was allowed to grieve before I went to war. When I was finished, I wiped my face, drank half a glass of cold water, and opened a new encrypted file on my laptop. Then I built a trap. I created a folder on my desktop, labeled it Daniel's Personal Files Estate Overview, and I filled it with carefully constructed decoy documents. A fake asset summary, an outdated draft of a secondary will Daniel had never signed, a spreadsheet of fictional accounts. Everything looked exactly real enough to be convincing. Then I installed a silent monitoring program on the file, one of the basic tools I use professionally that would send me an alert the instant anyone opened those documents from a device other than my own, capturing the IP address, device fingerprint, and exact timestamp. I left the laptop open on the kitchen counter the next morning when I went to shower, the decoy folder visible on the desktop. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Sandra, and she is the kind of lawyer who answers the phone on Sunday mornings without complaint. I told her everything. She told me she had already been expecting this call. We agreed on the next steps, and she began moving immediately. I went back downstairs and made coffee and waited. I did not wait long. By that afternoon, with my mother-in-law occupying my couch, watching television, and Renee supposedly taking a long walk to clear her head, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. My monitoring software had triggered. Someone had accessed the decoy folder from a device registered to a mobile hotspot 2 blocks from my house. The session lasted 11 minutes. They had opened every single file, including the fake unsigned will, and they had taken screenshots. Renee came back from her walk looking slightly flushed, her phone face down in her pocket. I poured her a cup of coffee and said nothing. Over the next 3 days, they began their operation with what I can only describe as breathtaking overconfidence. My mother-in-law requested a formal sit-down conversation with me and arrived at the kitchen table with a printed document she placed in front of me with both hands, like she was presenting something official. She called it a family agreement. It stated that in the interest of preserving Daniel's legacy and ensuring the business remained in the family, I would agree to a shared management structure, giving Renee operational control of the e-commerce business while I retained nominal ownership. A separate clause discussed the private trust, noting that the family had retained legal counsel to review whether it had been executed under appropriate conditions. I read every line slowly. "What exactly does this mean?" I asked, keeping my voice very soft. My mother-in-law reached across the table and patted my hand. "It means we take care of each other," she said. "It means Daniel's work stays in the family. You are still young, Maya. You can start over. You do not need to carry all of this alone." "I need a few days to think about it," I said. She smiled and said, "Of course." Renee, sitting at the far end of the table, smiled too. What neither of them knew was that Sandra had already filed the paperwork to officially register my full legal authority over Daniel's trust. The transfer of the business into my holding company would be complete within the week. The document they wanted me to sign was as legally valid as a piece of notebook paper. Daniel's trust superseded any family agreement they could draft, but I was not going to tell them that. Not yet. 3 days later, Renee escalated. I came downstairs in the morning to find her sitting at my kitchen island with her own laptop open, speaking on the phone in a low voice. She looked up when she heard me on the stairs, and instead of hanging up, she said into the phone, "Let me call you back," and set it down with the careful composure of someone who has been caught but is trying not to show it. She told me she had reached out to a probate attorney on behalf of the family. She said it gently, framed as concern. Explained that the family simply wanted to ensure everything was handled correctly. The attorney had advised that the circumstances of the trust, specifically the recency of certain amendments Daniel had made in the past year, were worth examining. She told me the attorney would be reaching out to Sandra directly to discuss a collaborative review of the estate. I nodded slowly. "I understand," I said. I called Sandra from the driveway, sitting in my car in the cold. She had already received the letter. The probate attorney had filed a motion with the court to place a temporary freeze on the estate pending a review of Daniel's mental competency at the time of the trust amendments. It was the exact strategy Renee had outlined the night I came home from the hospital, standing in my own living room while she thought I was outside. "Let them file it," I told Sandra. She paused. "Maya, a freeze order can take months to lift, even when the trust is completely legitimate." "I know," I said. "Let them file it. I want them to put their names on that motion. I want everything they are doing in the official public record." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and then Sandra said, "You already have something, don't you?" "I have several things," I said. "I need you to request an expedited hearing, and I need you to make sure the judge assigned has experience with estate fraud." The court date was set for 10 days later. During those 10 days, my mother-in-law and Renee continued to treat my home as though it was already theirs. Renee borrowed my car without asking. My mother-in-law rearranged my kitchen cabinets. They cooked elaborate dinners and invited my own mother, who lived 40 minutes away, and who had sided with them from the beginning, telling me privately that I needed to be gracious and that Daniel's family had suffered a loss too, and that sharing was simply the right thing to do. I let them cook in my kitchen, I let them rearrange my cabinets. I ate their dinners and said very little. And I continued building my case. The hearing was held on a cold Thursday morning in a courtroom downtown. Sandra and I arrived early, sat down at the respondent table, and waited. My mother-in-law entered in a charcoal blazer with her attorney, a mid-40s man named Gerald who carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had won a lot of simple cases. Renee followed, dressed in a navy suit, carrying a leather portfolio. My own mother sat in the gallery, looking uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes. Gerald opened with a polished presentation framing Daniel's trust amendments as the product of a man under significant psychological stress in the final months of his life, allegedly due to my influence. He presented a sworn statement from a psychologist hired by the family, never having met Daniel, who had reviewed Daniel's medical records and concluded that his mental state during the amendment period was potentially compromised. Gerald gestured toward Renee as he spoke about the family's deep involvement in the business, their intimate knowledge of Daniel's professional affairs, and their genuine concern that the estate had been structured in a way that did not reflect Daniel's true intentions. When Gerald finished, the judge looked across the room at our table. "Counsel for the respondent?" Sandra stood up. "Your Honor, the respondent will be brief." She submitted 3 exhibits. The first was the authenticated original trust document, bearing Daniel's verified digital signature, time-stamped and filed with the state 9 months before his death. Alongside it was a notarized letter from Daniel's estate attorney confirming that Daniel had met with him twice during the amendment process, that he had arrived alone, had asked detailed and coherent questions, and had made every decision independently and clearly. Gerald objected on procedural grounds. The judge overruled him. The second exhibit was the access log from my decoy folder, showing a login from Renee's mobile device 2 days after Daniel's death. Attached to it was a printout of the screenshots she had taken of the fake documents. Sandra explained to the judge, in very precise language, exactly what a digital honeypot is, how it functions, and what the log proved about Renee's intentions and her expectations regarding the estate. Renee stiffened in her chair. She leaned over and whispered something urgent to Gerald. He kept his expression neutral, but his pen had stopped moving. The third exhibit was a 47-page forensic accounting report documenting 22 months of irregular transactions from the business accounts, with a detailed breakdown of every transfer to Renee's personal PayPal, every inflated invoice, every kickback routed back to her through the supplier network she had introduced. Sandra placed a copy on the petitioner's table without comment. The judge took her reading glasses off and set them on the bench. She looked at Gerald. "Counsel, I would like to hear from your client regarding the financial transactions documented in Exhibit 3. Gerald asked for a brief recess. The judge denied it. What followed was not so much a legal argument as a slow, public collapse. My mother-in-law sat rigidly in her chair while Gerald attempted to reframe the embezzlement as a misunderstanding, an informal compensation arrangement that Daniel had verbally authorized. The judge asked for documentation of that authorization. There was none. Gerald suggested the records might be incomplete. The judge asked Renee directly whether she had an agreement with Daniel regarding compensation beyond her stated admin role. Renee said, into the court microphone, that it had been understood between them. The judge asked when that understanding had been reached. Renee said it had been an ongoing conversation. The judge looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at Sandra. "Does the respondent wish to make a statement?" I stood up. I had not planned to speak. Sandra had told me I did not need to. But I stood up anyway. And I looked across the room at my mother-in-law, who had not once in 7 years asked me a single genuine question about my life, and at Renee, who had sat across from me at Christmas dinner for the better part of a decade, and I said what I needed to say. "I loved your son," I said, looking directly at my mother-in-law. "I loved my husband completely, and he loved me, and he built a life with me on purpose, and he protected me on purpose, because he knew exactly who you both were. He removed Renee's access from the business 8 months ago because he found the same irregularities I found. He did not confront her. He just quietly took the keys away and said nothing to protect his mother from the truth about her daughter. That is the kind of man he was. And you are standing in a court of law trying to take everything he gave me while his funeral flowers are still sitting on my kitchen counter." The room was very quiet. The judge dismissed the motion to freeze the estate with prejudice. She referred the embezzlement documentation to the district attorney's office for review. She noted in her written order that the attempt to contest the trust using a hired psychological evaluation from a professional who had never once spoken to the deceased constituted a frivolous filing bordering on bad faith litigation. Gerald collected his papers quickly and said very little to his clients as they stood to leave. My mother-in-law walked past me without speaking. She did not look at me. Renee followed her. Her leather portfolio pressed against her chest like a shield, her face completely closed. My own mother remained in the gallery after they left. She was still sitting there when Sandra and I packed up our table, and when I finally looked over at her, she was crying quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I walked over and sat down beside her. "I did not know," she said, "meaning the embezzlement. Meaning all of it." "I know you didn't," I said. "I told you to share," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I told you to just give them what they wanted." "You did," I said. "And I know you thought you were protecting me from a fight." She reached over and took my hand, and I let her hold it, and we sat there for a while in the empty gallery without saying anything else. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into Renee's transactions, and she eventually entered a plea agreement that required full restitution and a permanent civil bar from serving in any financial or administrative capacity for a business she did not own. My mother-in-law moved back to her apartment in Pennsylvania. I have not spoken to her since the courthouse steps, and I have no plans to change that. I run the business now. It is doing better than it was when Daniel was alive, which would have made him laugh. I moved my own workspace into the spare bedroom where he first built it, because being in that room makes me feel close to him, and I am still learning how to carry grief without letting it flatten me. I also changed the locks. Not just on the house, on everything. Every account, every access point, every password. I did it methodically, room by room, platform by platform, the way I was trained. It took me an entire weekend, and when I finished, I sat on the kitchen floor and cried again, not from sadness exactly, but from something that felt more like relief, the sensation of a door finally closing on a version of my life that had been quietly open and unprotected for longer than I had realized. What I have learned, on the other side of all of it, is something I wish someone had told me earlier. The people who see your grief as an opportunity are not people who love you. They never were. And the most radical thing you can do in the face of that kind of betrayal is refuse to become smaller. Refuse to soften yourself to make their theft easier. Refuse to sign anything, surrender anything, or apologize for the life your partner deliberately left in your hands. Daniel knew what he was doing when he built that trust. He knew what he was doing when he quietly removed Renee's access without a word of drama. He was not naive about his family. He simply loved them in spite of what they were, and then he loved me enough to make sure they could not reach me. I try to carry that same clarity. Love the people worth loving. Protect what is yours. And when the people who are supposed to be your blood decide to treat your worst moment as their best opportunity, let them show you exactly who they are, and then let the evidence speak for itself. If you have ever had to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to protect you first, leave a comment below. And if this story found you at a hard moment, I hope it reminded you that grief and strength are not opposites. Sometimes, surviving is the most powerful thing you can do. Subscribe to Recovery Stories for more stories that come straight from the hardest and most honest places, because healing does not happen in silence, and you should not have to carry any of this alone.